Got it. All right. So we are going to welcome the laureates back to our committee on H-126. And today on with a slightly different angle on it. So welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Sheldon and the committee for having me back in. For the record, Lauren Oates, Director of Government Relations and Policy at the Nature Conservancy of Vermont. You're right, Chair. I was invited in today not necessarily to speak to biodiversity or community resilience, but on the importance of public engagement during statewide plan development. I was invited in by you and the Vice Chair, I believe largely given my role as a climate counselor in the development of the first climate action plan. And prior to that, I was the lead developer of the 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan too. So I have quite a bit of experience developing statewide plans and the different processes that got us to where we are today. As part of the Climate Action Plan development, there was certainly a lot to be learned from the importance of robust public discourse and engagement during plan development. It was a 2020 bill that led to the first ever, I believe, like full-on Zoom development of a climate action plan that made both public involvement more available because the public was able to Zoom into all of our meetings. But it also made maybe the engagement around it a bit more difficult. We were kind of flying that plane as we went. We did receive quite a bit of feedback from the public who was largely involved across the process, as well as feedback from the development of S148, the EJ bill last year, and the importance of engaging communities across Vermont, especially those who are overburdened and underrepresented in plan development process. The plan, as envisioned by H126, will identify how Vermont might conserve 30% of our lands by 2030 and 50% by 2050. To get there, I think it'll be no surprise to this committee to know that it's going to take a great deal of buy-in from Vermonters, as well as a great deal of resources to get us there. And to be successful in realizing the goals of H126, Vermonters really need to see themselves in the plan. They need to understand how the plan impacts their lives, how it supports their livelihoods, and their communities, etc. To do this, we need to ensure that we're broadly engaging Vermonters during the plan development, not just after the ink has dried. To that end, I'm really pleased to have heard the testimony provided by Trey Martin at the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, who gave a quick overview of what the public engagement process might look like in a VHCB-led convening process for a statewide conservation plan. And I think it was supported also by some previous testimony givers like Mr. Holshoe and Mr. Patch, that there be broad input during plan development. And I asked that the experts and partners who will actually inform the plan development are open to feedback and course correction during plan development if they hear that from Vermonters writ large. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have on thoughtful planning process. I do acknowledge that we're a bit behind on schedule here and that Alan's here ready for markup. But while I am here, and perhaps it's a benefit or a misfortune of being the last person to my testimony before markup, but I did just want to also acknowledge the fact that when I testified 2 weeks ago on H126, I extended my gratitude that the bill include waters, and as I saw in the most recent version posted, that waters was removed from the goals. I just want to acknowledge a bit of disappointment in that, in the removal of waters, especially given the biodiversity loss that our aquatic systems experience, as well as the community resilience potential they hold, which are the two foci of H126. Vice Chair Sevilla, you missed the planning process part, but I'm here to answer any questions about thoughtful public engagement during plan development. Yeah, I'll turn it over quickly. I want to be brief as possible.
Do members have questions? Madam Chair, I just wanted to ensure, and I will go back and watch the tape, that there was discussion about the process during the creation of the Climate Action Plan. Provide that testimony to the committee.
Yes.
Great.
I tried to do it as briefly as possible, but yes, I did.
Thank you. That's what I wanted.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So we've heard some testimony as to why we shouldn't include waters, that it's protected through other means, and that it shouldn't be used as a deduction from the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. How would you thread that needle, given sort of what you're saying that you'd like to see in it because of the biodiversity value as compared to some of the other comments we've heard?
So I'll agree that I wouldn't want it to be a deduction from any terrestrial-based conservation effort. I would just add, and I quickly pulled this off because I've heard that water is in public trust. So I just wanted to pull up the public trust doctrine. And I pulled out this quote: "The core of the public trust doctrine is the state's authority as sovereign to exercise supervision and control over the navigable waters of the state and the underlying lands." That definition and a couple of others do not confer protection or improved or restored condition of aquatic systems. All it says essentially is that it's up to the people of Vermont to make those decisions, that we generally defer to state agencies to steward those lands, those waters rather. H126 could and should acknowledge that gap, especially as my previously submitted testimony, which indicated, biodiversity loss of freshwater species is happening at twice the rate of terrestrial biomes. That 75% of Vermont's rivers are disconnected from their floodplains. If we're going to look at both biodiversity, which again is hit harder in freshwater systems than terrestrial, and community resilience, given climate trends and models, and knowing that we're going to experience worsening flooding, we really need to take a look at, is the public trust doctrine sufficient in creating a conserved or restored waterscape for the state?
Follow up, thank you. But the concept, I hear your point. I don't disagree. We're seeing, biodiversity loss, river fragmentation is not helpful. I hear your point, but the hours we've heard on Vermont conservation design is that it's focused on functions and features, and I guess does that not get at functioning water as well? If you're thinking of, does this have the like I'm thinking of the riparian map within the 3 maps that we've seen from testimony from Sorensen.
Well, if we were to believe the figure, 75% of our rivers are disconnected, of our mapped rivers are disconnected from their floodplains, then already that system is not functioning as it should. Sediment deposition between the water, the riverbank, and the floodplain is not happening as it should. Those areas aren't necessarily as vegetated as they could or should be to support cold water habitat and in-stream habitat. And then I've been trying to think of some type of thing to make the terrestrial system analogous to water. It's just so different, static versus dynamic. But one of the things that I can think of is, if you were to imagine a forest with 1 acre cut out in the middle and just had a concrete slab over it, that you lost the headwater storage potential of that land, you lost habitat connectivity, you lost carbon sequestration and storage. All of the benefits of that 1 acre parcel have been removed, and you might not consider it conserved anymore, even if it's surrounded by a forest. If you were to take that same slab of concrete and put it vertically in a river, i.e. a dam, you're impacting the connectivity. The aquatic species can't move up or downstream because of that dam. You're changing sediment deposition just like you would from the soil underneath that forested block. So I've been trying to think of a way to make it make sense, and I will continue to do that. And the Nature Conservancy will continue to advocate for the inclusion of water-based conservation language and any bill that we think that it's relevant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have directed the agency in this bill to help us understand how water conservation would fit into this, because we've heard conflicting testimony on it. So that we agree with you that water is obviously critical, but how exactly it fits into the overarching goals we've actually added to the deliverable, if you will, in the plan.
Okay, I think the most recent language, and I could be wrong because I was scanning just before coming in, as posted, the part of the plan that recognizes a discussion around or discourse around water. There's a will versus can, or may versus shall difference there that I think still lends the opportunity for water to be overlooked for aquatic systems.
So that's probably a segue to our next witness, and perhaps we'll have time to do a walkthrough of the latest draft.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Just to be clear about this, everybody here, at least I do, think exactly everything you said, I agree with entirely. The reason those words "and water" were taken out of those places is because we're talking about what we are going to conserve. You don't put conservation easements on water and you don't buy water. Therefore, in that context of that paragraph, it doesn't make sense.
Okay.
That's not to say water's not important. And there's any, so if we want to talk about, and obviously there are riparian areas around water are critical, and that's how you maintain water functions and values. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that we are actually all on the same page. It's a matter of how you say it.
Yes,
Just
definitely.
where it was, at least to me, does not logically make any sense.
Okay, I appreciate that
Okay.
clarification.
Right.
Thank you all.
Numbers we're going to have our legislative council, Ellen Checkhouse, join us for a walkthrough of the draft that Seth and I worked with her on over yesterday, really. Based on testimony, obviously, that we take.
Hello, Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. Quickly, Adam, have you been introduced to the committee? So Adam is here today. Adam is one of the student clinicians with the Office of Legislative Counsel, and so he has been following this bill.
Sorry, he's one of the what?
Student clinicians.
All right, great.
So he's a law student. And so he's been around, so now you can see him in person. All right. So yes, today we have draft 1.4. There was no draft 1.1, so please don't go looking for it. It is draft 1.4. It's posted on your website today under my name, and it's a strike-all amendment to H126. Based on the conversation this committee had on, oh, these are in color. Sorry. So the committee had some discussion on Friday. And as the chair just mentioned, some of those changes were requested and they are in this draft. So the first change is on page 3. But to quickly remind you, section 1 is the short title of the bill. Section 2 is the finding section. And there is one small change in the finding section on page 3. So, sorry, the photocopies I brought with me are not in color, but the ones on the document on the website should be. And so the changes are highlighted in yellow.
Actually, and also, Kate, did you give us copies? There were copies on our desk that are in color. So we have actually a lot of copies moving around the room.
You had copies? Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, hopefully there's enough paper. And I'm sorry for the confusion, but if you're looking at the online version, you can see the highlighting better. So on page 3, line 17. So this is the last finding on the list. So in order to maintain ecological functions in intact and connected ecosystems, the word conserve has been changed to maintain. All right. So the next section, starting on page 4, is section 3. These are the statutory provisions in the new chapter 89. There is one change in the definition section. It's on page 5 under the definition of conserve. The word permanently has been added. So page 5, line 4, conserved means permanently protected and meeting the definition of the 3 categories in this section.
All right, the next change is on page 5, line 8. So now in 2802, the conservation goals, it now reads, it is the goal of the state that 30% of Vermont's total land area be conserved by 2030 and 50% of the state's total land area be conserved by 2050. The Secretary of Natural Resources shall lead the effort in achieving these goals. So there are a couple of changes in this paragraph. First, the word shall has been struck in the first sentence and replaced with the language, it is the goal of the state. I think this was a suggestion from Eric Sorensen. And then also, as you just discussed, the word and waters has been struck from the goal section. And then in the second sentence, there's a slight rephrasing so that the Secretary of Natural Resources shall lead the effort in achieving these goals. It previously read shall assist the state in achieving these goals.
Good question.
All right, it's back.
Still on page 5, there's another change on line 18. And this was also a request from Eric Sorensen. In order to support an ecologically functional landscape and sustainable production of natural resources and recreational opportunities, the approximate percentages of each type of conservation category shall be guided by the principles of conservation science and the conservation targets within conservation design. So the phrase, the principles of conservation science, has been added. I'm sorry?
Sorry, Representative Tory?
Oh, principles instead of principles?
I think it should be the other principle.
Sure. This draft has not been edited, so that's a fair point. Yes.
Yep, LES, yep. So not your pals.
All right. All right, so starting on page 6, there are a series of changes based on the testimony that you heard from VHCB and Mr. Martin. The previous section that was the conservation plan has been divided into 2 sections, the conserved land inventory and the conservation plan. So on page 6, I'll read through the whole thing. So 2803, conserved land inventory. So on or before July 1, 2024, the Secretary, with assistance from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, shall create an inventory of Vermont's conserved land and conservation policies to serve as the basis of meeting the conservation goals of Vermont conservation design and to meet the goals established in 2802 of this title. The inventory shall be submitted for review to the House Committees on Environment and Energy and on Agriculture, Food Resiliency and Forestry, and the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy. The inventory shall include a review of the 3 conservation categories defined in 2801 and suggestions for developing any modifications or additions to these categories that maintain the core concepts in order to complete the conservation inventory. So that language in subdivision 1, I think you heard from Eric Sorensen with that request. So division 2, the amount of land in Vermont that is permanently conserved and the amount of permanently conserved land that generally falls into each of the 3 conservation categories defined in 2801, including public and private land. A summary of the totality of conservation practices, both permanent and intermediate, available for reaching the goals of this chapter, including what they are, what they do, how they contribute, and what metrics are available to quantify them. On to page 7. An assessment of how state lands will be used to increase permanently protected ecological reserve areas. The implementation methods that could be used for achieving the goals of this chapter using Vermont conservation design as a guide. An inventory and assessment of how water is protected in the state and how protection of aquatic systems may be addressed in the plan. How existing programs will be used to meet the permanent non-conversion conservation goals of this chapter, and recommendations for new programs that will be needed to meet the goals. An assessment of existing funding and recommendations for new funding sources that will be needed for acquisition of land, purchase or donation of conservation easements, staffing capacity, and long-term stewardship to meet the goals. An equity assessment of existing land protection and conservation strategies and programs, and an evaluation of the opportunities related to intergenerational land transfer trends and how the state could direct resources to achieve conservation at the time of transfer. So you will notice that most of these are largely identical from the bill as introduced, with a couple of I'd say mostly grammar changes or style changes related to them. Number 9 is new, and that was a suggestion from VHCB, although there is more related to this language on the next page in the plan itself. So on page 8, the conservation plan, honored for December 31st, 2025, the Secretary, with assistance from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, shall develop a plan to implement the conservation goals of Vermont conservation design and to meet the goals established in 2802. The plan shall be submitted for review to the House Committees on Environment and Energy and on Agriculture, Food Resiliency and Forestry, and the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy. The plan shall include a comprehensive strategy for achieving the goals of 2802, the implementation methods for achieving the goals of this chapter using conservation design as a guide, and recommendations to increase equitable access to protected and conserved land and land-based enterprises. In developing the plan, the Secretary, with assistance from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, shall hold not less than 3 public meetings on the plan and accept public comments. The Secretary shall solicit input from various stakeholders, including private owners of forest lands and agricultural lands, land trusts, conservation organizations, environmental organizations, working lands enterprises, outdoor recreation groups and businesses, Indigenous groups, regional planning commissions, conservation commissions, and relevant state and federal agencies. The conserved land inventory shall be updated annually to track progress towards meeting the goals of this chapter. So the language of the plan, it largely comes from what was in the underlying bill. There's the addition of the separate date for the plan, as well as the phrase, a comprehensive strategy for achieving the goals, and the equity access assessment requested by VHCB.
Thank you, Ellen. Members will, obviously it's the first time you're seeing this. We'll have other opportunity later in the week to review it. We did get a suggestion from Acting Commissioner Danielle Fitzko to change on page 5, line 3. Instead of not cause damage to other ecosystems, change it to not degrade ecosystem function. Ask that you make that change. And then, members have kind of any big picture questions for now. We do have witnesses waiting on the 3 o'clock time slot. So
we just, just for this, so we tried to do with this was, it was all a bit of a mix before and broke out the inventory part so that we really have that as the starting point and get that 1 year ahead of the plan. So the inventory, which is kind of like just doing what's already there and understanding what that informs the plan. So that was the intention. We had talked about that. Just trying to make it happen.
Right. Thank you very much, Ellen.
Say, Madam Chair, I'm still working on language for finding and to plan for housing.
And I just sent to Ellen proposed amendment language from, you asked who was writing it. It was the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, Land Access Opportunity Board, Legislative Advocacy Work Group. So we have a finding. So just kind of some general language.
Did you copy me on that?
I did not, but I will forward it to you right now.
For more.
Is that a new edition? Oh, it's coming.
All right, numbers are. Yeah, we're gonna have some line. Says, next up, we're shifting gears to the budget on telecom strategy. What's that? Oh, McElveen. Welcome, Claire McElveen. Or welcome, June Tierney. Great. All right, we're having a technological switch, but you are here with us on our Zoom screen, our stand-in Zoom screen.
Thank you so much, Chair Sheldon. It's good to see the committee again. We're having some issues of our own today, so I apologize in advance if this hearing isn't everything that was advertised. But I have Dr. Claire McElveny with me today, who will be pinch hitting in place of Director TJ Poore. Every once in a while, what happens in our world is the PUC has a hearing that goes a good deal longer than anybody anticipated. And so both Director Poore and Director Porter are still trapped in that hearing, and I'm pinch hitting as best as I can. I also have with me Corey Chase from our Telecom and Connectivity Division, and his job is to keep me honest if I say anything irresponsible about the $10 million cell service project and the telecom plan. My suggestion is that we start with Dr. McElveny. She will be talking about the equity outreach project that we're doing, and then move to the other two if that works for you.
Sure.
All right, take it away, Claire.
For the record, Claire McElveny. I'm a data and equity policy manager at the Department of Public Service. And I appreciate the title doctor. I am working on my PhD, but I haven't quite earned that distinction yet. Someday. I do have a few slides. Would it be helpful if I share my screen, or you all have them in front of you and I'll just walk through?
Yeah, you can share your screen. Fine. We will probably do a little both here, but I think it's good for the public.
Great. We'll go into I'll just confirm folks can see my slides, not the presenter version.
We could see them a little better just a minute ago. Now we're seeing two slides. When you first opened it, it was one big slide.
All right, how's that?
Yeah.
Great. So as Commissioner Tierney mentioned, I'm here today specifically to talk about the department's budget request related to our electricity policy and programs review. And before diving into the request itself, I have a few slides to provide some context on what we're doing. So as I'm sure many of you know, we currently have several programs and policies in Vermont that work to help advance renewable electricity in the state, including the Renewable Energy Standard, which sets requirements for the electric utilities to procure a specific amount of electricity from renewable resources. The Standard Offer Program, which has helped deploy small-scale renewables in the state through a centralized government-run program. And then, of course, the net metering program, which allows Vermont's homes and businesses to self-generate their own power if they'd like to. So to help meet our state renewable energy and greenhouse gas reduction requirements and goals, the 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan, which we released just about a year ago, suggested that we should consider or recommended we consider adjustment to the renewable energy standard and the complementary set of programs that support it through a transparent and open process, and that this consideration should include reviewing whether we should move towards a low carbon or carbon-free standard in addition to 100% renewable energy standard, and then how we might develop a cohesive set of programs to support that. And this recommendation was consistent with recommendations from the 2021 Climate Action Plan, which recommended that we move to 100% carbon-free or renewable electricity standard by no later than 2030. So in working to advance this recommendation, we really wanted to come up with a process that would reflect learnings that we experienced through the development of those two plans, through the public engagement process that was envisioned and what was accomplished, and particularly perspectives, I think, elevated through some of the subcommittees, including the Just Transition subcommittee. So starting last summer, we initiated a review process, starting with a request for input where we actually asked the public what they thought such a process to review these programs should look like. And through the responses we received through that process, and again, those learnings that I mentioned, we've put together a public engagement plan, which
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? I think we have a question.
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks, I'm Chair. The recommendation to consider a low carbon standard or a carbon-free standard, was that from the Climate Council in the Climate Action Plan, or was that from the Public Service Department?
Both. So the words here in italics are from the Comprehensive Energy Plan in the electricity chapter, and then there was a similar recommendation, a consistent recommendation through the Climate Action Plan.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions while I paused?
Not seeing anything.
Okay. So to guide this process, we released a public engagement plan at the end of last fall, which has sort of these four broad goals, really hoping to put together a public engagement process that would allow the public to provide input before we develop recommendations, so reaching a much broader array of Vermonters than those who are typically engaged in these conversations, creating inclusive spaces where stakeholders feel that they're able to share their opinions and their expertise, being transparent with how the feedback we receive during these engagement opportunities actually becomes incorporated into recommendations, and then also beginning to build capacity and relationships for engagement in these conversations in the long term, so that extend beyond this specific review process, thinking about how we're developing a community engagement plan under the recently passed environmental justice legislation. So the budget that I'll be speaking to on the next slide is part of this effort. We've put out, three broad phases of engagement that we're hoping to inform the recommendations for any programmatic changes or modifications to help meet our state climate and energy goals. So the first phase is really focused on building awareness of this campaign and capacity building, so providing educational opportunities through the winter and spring, such as our ongoing public engagement webinar series. Then moving into a second phase in the spring and summer, focus on more substantive policy conversations about what our current policies are and ideas for how we may need to change them in the future. And then as we move into the fall and the early winter, developing recommendations, reviewing those recommendations to inform or provide to the legislature before the next session. And this plan, sets out kind of a proposal. We said it was a proposal in December for where we'd like to go with this process, but by design, knowing that, we're learning as we going, we've left room for flexibility to evolve as different needs are sort of raised to our attention throughout the process. So in terms of the budget request, we've made a request for $300,000 total, broadly falling into 4 buckets, but I'll just note in advance that these allocations may shift throughout the process, as I mentioned, as we learn different needs for public engagement specifically, but broadly split between about $150,000 for comprehensive polling services. This was through the request for input we launched last July, one of the most frequently cited engagement opportunities people were interested to see. So this would help support comprehensive statewide polling. About $100,000 to conduct targeted outreach to communities with the support of partner organizations, funding things such as time to co-design events, compensate participants as appropriate, or provide translation and language access services as needed, or a couple of examples of where that might go. About $25,000 for facilitation services to support things like interactive workshops or public hearings that we conduct as part of this, and then another $25,000 just for general outreach funds for miscellaneous tasks that come up throughout the process. For example, like for advertising, additional language access services as needed, IT needs and things like that. So this was my last slide, and happy to take questions or hand it back to Commissioner Cherney if you have anything you want to add about this effort.
No, you did an outstanding job, Claire. I stand by my promotion of you to doctor, even if you haven't earned the precise moniker yet. You will in very short order. Madam Chair, back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that testimony. Do members have questions? Yeah, Representative Tory.
Thank you. My question is just about public engagement processes more generally in the department. Like, do you have one anyway, a standalone one, and this is sort of an enhanced effort based on the climate action plan?
Go ahead. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I think I'll take that question. The work that we're doing here for doubling down on changing how we reach out, or better said, trying to do new work in that arena, is actually organic to the department. And it was very happily coincidental with where the Climate Council went. But the department has been doing outreach for many years, both through our regulatory proceedings before the PUC, where we take public comment, for instance, in public hearings before every single case. And also when we do planning activities, whether it's the comprehensive energy plan or the telecom plan that you're going to hear about in a little bit. And in all of those venues across the board, we haven't been any happier with the degree to which that outreach has been effective than many of our critics have been. And I know that this legislature has also given a lot of time and energy to the question of how do we make sure we are reaching people. In trying to take this tack, we are reacting to the same stimuli of the moment that energized the Climate Council as well, in that when you do equity work, especially environmental justice work, but just equity work across the board, you are maybe an inch deep into it before you realize that so much government action in the past has been a function of government showing up and saying, here's what we've decided to do, what do y'all think? Instead of starting with, why don't you tell us your thoughts, and then let us see if we can come up with a policy that is reflective or best reflective of your thoughts. So this is definitely new for the department, and we're hopeful that it will yield insights about how we can improve engagement across the board. But historically, the means available to us have been anything from mailers to convening hearings in communities to, with the advent of the internet, doing email blasts, and then of course soliciting participation from folks who identify themselves to us in PUC proceedings. Does that answer your question?
Does, thanks.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in this presentation under context, The first bullet point is the renewable energy standard, which requires electric utilities to buy a specific amount of electricity from renewable energy resources. Is there a penalty if that electric utility can't comply?
Sorry.
Claire, you want to take that one? Or shall I take it?
You can go ahead. It gave
Okay.
me a minute to come off mute.
I wouldn't call it a penalty, Representative. There is statutorily what's called an alternative payment that the utility makes if they haven't met the standard. And then penalties don't come into play until somebody has actually violated the law. And there can be any number of reasons why the standard might not have been met. So in the first instance, it's either make the procurements or make an alternative payment.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Representative Sebelia.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner and Claire. Question about, we've taken some testimony on a different bill on ensuring, providing funds to ensure public participation, childcare, perhaps time. Taking a little bit of testimony, it's not in our bill yet. In your budget, do you envision that happening? Hello? Did you freeze?
No, we haven't. I think Claire's wondering whether I'm going to answer that question.
No, I was just going to ask if you could just clarify the question.
Can we, maybe it's time to stop sharing the screen.
Yeah.
That'd be good. Then we could see you. Great, thanks.
Sorry, could you just clarify your question in terms of what we would be expecting in this process?
So in your budget, in your public outreach budget, I did not see specifically funding for childcare or offsetting the cost of the public to participate. Have you included that or envisioned that as being part of your budget?
Oh yeah, thanks for clarifying. Yes, we have. I didn't list it in the slide today, but we did include that in estimates of if we were to say hold an event in a community with a partner organization, what we might need if we were to provide compensation, if we were to need to provide things like childcare, translation services, things like that.
Then I do have one more question. So the result of this work will benefit the legislature how?
So we didn't include this in the slide deck, but as part of our public engagement plan, we outline what we expect to come out of this process. So we expect to have a report on the public engagement itself. So what we did during each of the phases, what the outcomes were, who we reached, who we potentially didn't reach, including any supporting technical analyses and equity impact assessments. And then also a summary of the recommendations that come out of the process for how we might move forward with our renewable policies and programs. And we would expect that, again, in time to inform the next legislative session. And we hope that will be representative of a broad array of voices who come and are able to participate in these events.
All right, I'm not seeing any further questions. Thank you.
Actually, I do have one more question.
One more
Sorry.
question.
Sorry. In that report, do you expect to have any reporting on the potential effect of the recommendations on rates?
We're still in the process of scoping out what any technical analyses would look like, but I would expect so. I mean, our current, we do an annual reporting on the renewable energy standard, and that includes metrics such as rate impact, greenhouse gas reductions, overall cost of the program. So I would expect anything. We will have that annual report that's due every year in addition to these recommendations, and then possibly some technical analyses above and beyond what we might do. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I see that there are other people testifying. That's not, we're gonna see more about the budget.
Yes.
Great.
That's the intent.
Okay. Because I don't see anything else online, but.
Madam Chair, shall I?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not quite sure whether we're talking about more about the budget as in the bigger budget, Representative Stebbins, or whether you're talking about the department budget. But the next two items are definitely budget items for the department. One of which is a capital fund item, the cell tower program. And then the other one that I'll very briefly touch on right now is the $300,000 for the telecom plan. And just to give you a little bit of background, the department does a 10-year look out on telecommunications every 3 years per statute. Customarily, we have done that work in-house, but in recent years, quite a bit of that work has been contracted out. And during the pandemic, we had the benefit of sizable federal funding, something I think in the neighborhood of $800,000 between two appropriations that were made, that allowed the department to put together what I consider to be a very robust telecommunications plan. And this cycle that we're now starting with the $300,000 on the table is something in the nature of an update to that plan. At the moment, we don't have a telecom director. That's why you're seeing me today. And we are also down a staff person in that division. So it is especially important this time around that we be able to contract for outside expertise. That's basically all I had on the telecom plan. If there are questions from the committee.
Questions, Representative Stebbins?
I do not have questions on the telecom plan.
Okay.
Other members have questions on telecom.
I do have a question on another item I have not heard the commissioner talk about, which is the $500,000 to upgrade and expand the EPSD case management system.
I can certainly speak to that if you like. It's basically a long overdue modernization effort. Our records are partially electronic right now, but the project is incomplete and is largely concentrated in our Consumer Affairs Public Information Division. But what we need is a good interface with the Public Utility Commission, and also improved capacity for our DigSafe program, and also a deep modernization of our public advocacy. They think of it as a law firm that needs to be modernized as well. And so that's what that's about.
Is this the same thing as the EPUC? Is this the EPUC or different?
This is the department's version of that. The EPUC many moons ago, back when I was general counsel at the PUC, at the time that project had envisioned that much of that work would be done for the department as well, but that isn't how the project management has sugared out over the years. So the result has been an excellent product for the Public Utility Commission that is running very nicely. But the work to bring along the department in that same vein has stalled out over the years. And this is our initiative to get it back on track. And one of the issues, as you may recall, has been funding. But at long last, we have a little bit of reserves that I can now put toward that, and that's what I've chosen to do.
Thank you. All right.
So, if I may observe casually, Chair Sheldon, of the many things that this committee could spend its time on, the one area that you probably do not need to spend a lot of time on is the telecom plan. So I hope that makes people feel better. It received a lot of attention in the last cycle, and so I think that's something that you can sort of put your attention elsewhere. And by all means, have me in for questions if you have any. That brings us to the cell proposal. For many of you on the committee, this will look like a return of something that we suggested last year, but with a broader funding, or more funding, basically. I think we've suggested 50 million at the time. And so this is a second attempt to move the state toward making an investment in expanding our cell service. It's not complicated. We're proposing to spend $10 million on conducting a thorough engagement process to identify priority sites for subsidizing the construction of cell service towers. The structure of the program is such that as a condition of taking the funding, there would also need to be a commitment to locating on the towers so that we can bring cell coverage to places in the state where there are just terrible gaps. I am well aware that there are philosophical differences about whether to expend public funds in this nature. And on my side of the table, the way it looks is we found our way there with broadband, recognizing that we had to close market gaps for broadband because private capital wasn't going to do it. And there's pretty much the same problem in the cell service space. So the goals of this $10 million spend would be to deploy up to 20 new mobile wireless installations that would improve mobile wireless service along state highways and in population centers. This would ensure there's uniform voice coverage along targeted corridors from one or more of the 3 nationwide carriers for public safety and commerce, and it would improve mobile wireless data services for public safety, commerce, and the Internet of Thing applications, such as keeping our vehicles connected when they're on the roads. Access to mobile wireless service is every bit as important as access to broadband service. Mobile voice service is quickly replacing landline services as the dominant form of voice communication. And it's also indispensable for public safety as it allows communication for residents and tourists and first responders when they're on the road. Mobile data is also valuable for the transportation sector, and specifically with regard to what I just mentioned, the Internet of Things, because it enables technologies, especially technologies on the go. Still, unfortunately, it is the fact that the states, meaning state government, has even less ability to manage the deployment of wireless service than we do for broadband service. And therefore, you do need an economic development program that includes active participation by national mobile carriers who serve Vermont customers. The national carriers almost exclusively own the spectrum and nationwide capability necessary to develop mobile coverage that is usable to the general public. And this proposal aims to improve the availability of cell service coverage by using a framework that encourages national carrier participation while avoiding the pitfalls of the state's past attempts to improve wireless service. Now, the way we would do this is we would deploy up to 20 mobile wireless installations throughout the state. And the goal would be to accomplish that through a request for proposal where bidders would receive funds to deploy towers or other structures capable of supporting wireless infrastructure, which they would own and then lease to providers at fixed rates. There are 5 proposed stages in this program. The first is already underway. It's a drive test that we've been doing with the help of outside contractors this time to identify priority road corridors and do traffic and population analysis. The second point would be to identify suitable tower sites to serve these priority areas. The third step would be to conduct a request for proposal to confirm interest and identify co-location rates. And by interest, I mean interest of carriers to construct a tower, own a tower, lease a tower. The fourth step would be to offer funds to providers then to deploy their network infrastructure at these tower locations. And finally, there would be a second RFP process to actually deploy the towers at these locations. And I want to speak a moment to the identifying the suitable tower sites point, because I think this is one that is an opportunity to get something right in Vermont that has been stalling the deployment of cell service, and that is the taking proper account of community sentiment and the siting of towers. So what would happen under this proposal is that the state would contract with an engineering company to determine how best to serve the priority areas that have been identified through the drive testing. And this would identify 20 search rings, if you will, which are geographic areas in which a tower could be deployed to reach an identified unserved area. And the process would have to identify areas that would allow interconnection with an existing network to provide optimal integration with that network. These sites may and likely will work to some extent for other providers as well. And the contractor would also design the RFPs for the subsequent phases of the project. And we anticipate that all of that would cost about $500,000. I then want to speak next to the facilities deployment piece of this, where building towers alone is not enough to improve cell service. You also have to get people to put their equipment on those towers. So the folks who get the awards in the initial phase in the co-location RFP would also be allowed to seek reimbursement for an average of $150,000 per tower to support a portion of the carrier's capital costs. And in some situations, the economics of a site might require higher capital support. The grant administrator would have the flexibility to assign grant amounts on a per site basis, depending on the demand and density of the site coverage area. And we anticipate that this phase would cost about $300,000 for each of the 20 sites for a budget of $6 million. Then we would have the tower siting RFP, which we budget at approximately, tower construction approximately of $200,000 per site for a budget of $4 million. We would be doing this work in conjunction with the Agency of Transportation and the Department of Public Safety, as well as the regional planning commissions. That's what I've got by way of outline. Are there questions from the committee?
Representative Pat.
Thanks. Could you say a little bit about, as you know, there have been some communication, absent of this program, there have been some communication towers that have been very controversial in certain communities, and some not so much or not at all. And we've talked about this previously, where some of the developers of towers do a very good job in terms of community contact before they ever get formal with a proposal, and others don't. And so what role would in this program and with the department, what role would you have in that?
Yes, well, I'll ask Corey to supplement anything that I say, but one of the conditions of accessing the funding would be, in other words, in making a proposal, would be being able to demonstrate what the community outreach has been to ascertain the degree to which the project is welcome in the community. In other words, you don't even get started in the program unless you're able to demonstrate that there is local buy-in for the project. Corey, if I've mangled that, would you correct me, please? I mean, you're muted.
Excuse me, sorry about that. I would just add that the way the project is envisioned, once the priority areas have been identified, we envision a public outreach process that will include speaking with the RPCs and the towns to say these are priority areas where we've identified there is no cell service and there's significant population or traffic. And that would be a good time for the town to weigh in and say, well, yes, we think this is important, or no, we really don't. And then we'll have the search rings. The search rings are areas that our RF contracted engineer would suggest would be a good place to put a tower to reach those priority areas. That would be another good place for the towns to weigh in and say, no, actually, we know that hillside tower to provide coverage, but really, we don't want a tower there. We envision significant opportunities for engagement in that process.
Thank you.
So, Paul, Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In regards to the cell tower plan, has there been any mapping done by the department, like preliminary mapping, or is that going to be all part of the RFP?
Corey, can you answer that? I think that connects to the drive test that we've been doing this past year, doesn't it?
It does indeed. We've completed we did the drive test this fall with our partners at Agency of Transportation, and the Agency of Transportation maintenance staff drove 6,000 miles this fall to drive all of the main roads in the state, and that information collected during the drive test has been compiled and published in a report. That report was submitted to the legislature with our annual report. It's available to you. It's also posted as an interactive map on our website, and it's available for consumers to see. At this point, we have the information available about, you can see where the service is available. We have not moved forward onto the next kind of stage of this process to analyze the information and try and identify priority areas, because would entail some significant effort, and we're waiting for direction from the legislature in funding this program.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually have a question. Can you tell me how much of the FirstNet, how many of those towers, like how many more of those do we expect, and how will they kind of interface with this program?
Corey, if you are able to answer that question, otherwise I think public safety would be a good place to go for that. Commissioner Morrison.
Yes, I concur. That's a question better addressed to public safety.
So there's no coordination between these two projects?
No,
certainly.
I mean, there's overlap in the, yes, I'm sorry, I spoke too soon. Go ahead, Corey. What I meant to say is there's no coordination in terms of regulatory authority. Go ahead, Corey.
At this point, we haven't coordinated with FirstNet to look to where those would be with public safety. We have not yet coordinated with public safety to ensure that there's no overlap. But certainly if this were funded, we would consider where FirstNet plans to deploy towers that have not yet been deployed as part of the process.
And if I could just elaborate on that, the work that's been done so far is to examine where there is no cell service, which includes, to the extent the FirstNet has infrastructure up, that would not be areas that we would be identifying because they're there and they have infrastructure. So it's not that there's no coordination. It's the thinking, the architecture here is being done with the fact of FirstNet existing in mind. But it's more that our work is derivative from what is left after FirstNet is deployed, and not so much working with FirstNet to arrange to put a tower here or there, because again, that's a degree of interface that really requires more certainty of direction and funding for the department before we could do that.
But generally, how far along are they in that project?
Again, I really think that's something you might want to ask public safety, sorry.
Oh,
I know it's counterintuitive, but it's true. This is a project that is very specifically committed to the Department of Public Safety.
Yeah, I understand that, but it seems as that we may get a considerable amount of coverage of the state through that program, and this is a big ask here. So I'm just trying to understand what the gaps might be.
That's fair. We certainly were hoping for a great deal of coverage from that project, and the point of this is to focus on what is left over.
Right. Representative Bongart's then Siberia.
When one of you was testifying, you used the term gaps in coverage in densely populated areas. I heard that said. And I'm thinking about more rural areas, communities that are not densely populated on the one hand, but on the other don't have cell service. Are we going to be looking to ensure that they have the opportunity for coverage as well? Or is that through the FirstNet side? So how's this all interfacing, and how do I make sure that my rural communities don't get left out of cell service as this goes forward?
So the way I would look at this is when we use the term dense population in this context, it's language that is both descriptive and failing us at the same time, because by definition, we're talking about an area that's not dense in population. So within the most rural parts of the state, we're looking for the anchors of the most population within those rural areas. I don't know that we have the ability to plan for reaching every person, every structure with cell service in Vermont. Though that's a much bigger capital investment for sure. But this is a step directly headed toward bringing coverage to parts of the state that have to date been left behind in terms of cell service, and for obvious reasons, because the capital investment for private companies isn't justified because there isn't a sufficiently dense population base for it. So it's not a satisfying answer. How do you ensure that for every constituent? You make a much bigger capital investment than what we're asking for here.
June, may I add to something?
Please do. Yes.
I think that the representative was commenting on something that I had said. I said that we now have information that depicts across the state roads that we have driven where we've identified that there's no coverage. So we know where there is no coverage. We also know that the amount that we're asking for, as the commissioner said, is not sufficient to solve all problems. What we need to do is try to prioritize of those areas that lack service, which are the most important to us right now, and where do we want to spend limited funds. And so our thought is to try to identify of those areas that lack service, which are most densely populated, which make the best business case for the of the places that lack service, which are the most attractive places for the companies to deploy service to. Because that's what we're trying to balance. We want to deploy service to areas that lack coverage. And the reason that they lack coverage is that there's a difficult business case to deploy service there at all. So we need to prioritize amongst those areas that lack service, which we intend to seek coverage with this program.
Representative Sibilia.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Corey. And I just want to note your work, not only this past year, but over many years in the mapping of cellular throughout our state and helping both our state and the FCC understand what is and is not being covered, oftentimes contrary to claims by the cellular providers. And so thank you. That's been quite a program that you've been running for a number of years, and I think has been quite a service to our state and to some level of holding these carriers accountable. I appreciate the ongoing work envisioned here on that drive mapping, as well as the work to prioritize area road segments for service. I would note that FirstNet, the FirstNet program, AT&T was awarded $6.5 billion for that system across the country. And they were given access to 20 megahertz of low band spectrum, which is quite something. That's a pretty significant award for a private sector company. I appreciate that we need to have that public safety, hear from public safety about the operation of that, but certainly we can't not consider the coverage that those towers and that spectrum and that public investment is supposed to be making in Vermont. And I would just note that is on the heels of other significant public investment that have been made in our telecommunications companies in this country and our inability to hold them accountable for providing service. And so, while I appreciate the mapping and the prioritization and the work that the department would do to help troubleshoot some of the placement of this within communities, once again, and I'm sure not at all to the surprise of you or Commissioner Tierney, I am deeply opposed to additional taxpayer dollars being awarded to private sector telecom companies that we cannot hold accountable for ensuring coverage, especially considering the accuracy of Commissioner Tierney's claim that we cannot guarantee coverage for Vermonters in doing this. And I share Representative Bongart's sentiment as well, that how do we know that this will reach all Vermonters? The system right now, our telecommunications companies build where they can make the most money. This invests in that system, the investment to those companies. And so I don't want to, I really want to underscore appreciation. I know that you and the department understand these issues and are advocating for Vermont on these issues federally. So I don't want to, undercut the work that you are doing to try and help Vermonters. But I personally cannot support public investment that goes to these national telecommunications providers until we can hold them accountable for the investment. So that's what I have to say about that. But just thanking you again, Corey, for all of your work over the years to highlight where this is not succeeding. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Tory.
I have a question that may or may not be relevant. It's from Representative Stebbins, who had to step out, about funding for staff generally in that department. Is this a good opportunity?
Sure. Yes,
Okay.
good time.
So my question is for the commissioner. And it is just a reminder for the committee on how funding comes into the department for staff and whether the trends you're seeing in terms of that source is upwards or downwards, and whether there's anything that you feel should be done about it.
Okay, so the Department of Public Service is what we call specially funded, which means that the legislature has authorized a special charge, a gross receipts tax, which utilities that are subject to our regulatory authority and that of the PUC pay. And that rate of charge is set by statute. And the legislature revisited that for the first time in 40 years, I think in 2018, if memory serves. So it is the custom of the department to cut its cloth according to the revenue that is realized from that charge. And that is what we have done, I think, with success, not always without pain. In the early years of my tenure, there was a considerable amount of pain because the department was looking at a deficit. But a combination of actions taken by the legislature at the urging of the administration and other folks who realized the situation had to be addressed. There was an increase authorized for the gross receipts tax, as well as the institution of a citing fee, because so much of the department's work had started to become proceedings that involved citing renewable generation. And so developers are now newly, well, at the time, newly charged a fee for the processing of and regulatory review of their citing applications. That revenue is at this point, I think, sufficient to maintain the department at its present staffing levels. We do have considerable federal funding coming into the state that requires new work of the department, but it's unclear the degree to which that federal funding is authorized for use in staffing up. And also, it's no secret that Governor Scott is very careful about expanding the workforce of the state government as well. So the department is managing its work as best as it can. I would say, you've asked whether it's trending up or down. A few years ago, we did a revenue study that indicated that the revenue would be declining. There are some dynamics in the telecommunications market that indicate or suggest that revenue from the telecommunications providers that are subject to the gross receipts tax would be trending down. We do, though, also have electrification that is taking root, and I think it's reasonable to expect that as a function of electrification, there will be a commensurate increase in gross receipts tax revenues from the electric utilities selling that electricity. But I couldn't tell you to a scientific certainty or to a dollar cent certainty whether it's a steady trend up or steady trend down. We have been in a better position these last 2 years than we were in the first 2 years of my tenure. There have been some events that I do have to very respectfully urge all committees to consider as they contemplate legislation that affects the workload of the department. When the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed several years ago, there wasn't a single resource appropriated to the department for that. But we wound up spending, I would say, roughly 3 to 4 full-time FTE positions working on the bulk of the climate, not the bulk, but working on the climate council work and the climate action plan. That just turned out to be an enormous amount of work that was completely unfunded by the general fund, and certainly nothing we could pay for on a sustainable basis through our gross receipts tax. It meant shifting work away from other things we needed to be doing. And I don't want to get into the clean heat standard or affordable heat standard that's hasn't crossed over to you folks yet. But I do want to flag, just as a general matter, that when you appropriate significant new responsibilities to the department, we are at a place now budgetarily where we can't absorb something like that without additional funding.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Further questions for the Commissioner, Representative Bogarts?
I just want to play out because there's a big chunk of money that we're talking about here, and I want to. So, what level of accountability, as you put out the RFP and somebody and companies were to respond to that, and the money, the $10 billion would start to go out, what level of accountability is there in your mind? Or how do we ensure that it's doing what we want it to do, which is still a question I'm not clear about. But anyway, how do we then, what mechanisms for accountability do you have, and do you use, or would you use to ensure actually get real
those
benefit?
are very fair and thoughtful questions that tee up a conversation that needs to be had beyond the State House, and it needs to be had nationally as well. There is, in my mind, a distinction between what you do to make sure that you have robust infrastructure to provide what I think everybody in the room will agree is a necessary service, and what you do to ensure that representations about the service that's being provided, in fact, are accurate. And it's a mystery to me. Representative Sibilia knows that I cover a lot of territory as the Commissioner of the Department of Public Service, but I cannot be everywhere at all times. And it has always been a mystery to me how it is that representations and advertisement about speeds of service, extent of service, presence of service, and the like, they don't always seem to match reality, as we have demonstrated conclusively, in my opinion, through our drive test work. So the enforcement mechanism, the accountability mechanism for that, it seems to me, and this is the mystery part, already exists. That's called fair trade practices. If consumers are, being advertised one thing and they buy the product and it doesn't turn out to be that thing, that just doesn't seem right. And the jurisdiction for that resides squarely with the Attorney General of every state, and also with the Federal Communications Commission, which has first line regulatory supervisory authority over these matters. Now, to go to the infrastructure part, I think this is where I'm getting out of my depth. I am not a physicist. I am not a specialist in the science of signals and the like. But it is a fact that when you put out a wireless signal, there can be atmospheric conditions, there can be topographic conditions, There can be, for that matter, user groups, meaning the number of people trying to avail themselves of bandwidth at a given time. Those are all factors that can affect the strength of a given signal, such that one day at a given hour, there might be that cell coverage that's been advertised in that place, but change some of those factors, and at that hour on the next day, it might not be there. I really am stretching here in order to make the point that the way we think about cell service needs to be more granularly fleshed out so that we recognize where we are experiencing a mismatch in expectations and reality. Ideally, we would blanket the entire state with robust cell coverage that is uninterrupted for every single person. That seems like a reasonable thing to expect as a consumer of cell service. And yet I have been nowhere in the world, and I've been to some places that have some pretty much more sophisticated cell infrastructure than we do. I've never been anywhere in the world where that kind of pervasive 24/7 uninterrupted signal coverage exists. I'm going to ask Corey if he has anything he would add to my comments to help answer that question.
June, your answer was very thoughtful and helpful. I think to the specific proposal that we're discussing here, the public service obligation, as it is envisioned in this proposal, the public service obligation would be for the grantee to deploy service on the tower that we construct. So for instance, we identify an area in Woodbury that has, I'm just picking on Woodbury, but we identify a route there that is a priority area. Our expert that we retain identifies a hill that would be a good place for which a tower could deploy service to that priority area. Let's just say AT&T is the carrier that, or FirstNet is the carrier that agrees to deploy service there. The way this would play out is that we would do an RFP to retain a tower company to deploy a tower there, and AT&T would deploy service on that tower. Their obligation is to deploy service there. And our expert that we retained to do the RF analysis would have said that a tower on this hill will provide service to the priority area that we've identified. So I'm trying to summarize that the public service obligation here is really to deploy service in the area that we identified. Obviously, we can't serve everywhere, but we're confident that this structure will, that the structure of this program would lead to service being deployed in areas that we identified as priorities. And we're also confident that these are areas that are generally unlikely to get service otherwise.
If I could add to that, Corey,
Yeah,
in terms of accountability too, there certainly are some conditions that can be put into grant agreements. And then there's a verification process. The tower's built, the service has been deployed, and we're out there measuring, is in fact that signal available as required by the grant agreement. It's just that has to be tempered by the reality of what I mentioned a moment ago, which is that cell service isn't like turning on a water spigot where water comes out at a steady, predictable stream. That's item one. Item two that I would want to leave the committee with is, I think Representative Sibilia very clearly and understandably pointed out that she has certain views about this, and others I'm sure do as well. And the point is that if we don't do something different, the fact of those deserts, the fact of those unserved areas is going to remain with us. This is not going to change unless we find the will to do something different. And I could understand last year in proposing 50 million that the legislature took the decision that that wasn't the time to expend that kind of money. But that's why we're back here with a more modest proposal on the theory that perhaps you could see your way to appropriating this money and we could, get going on making some real change for Vermonters. But the status quo is not going to yield anything better for these people. And in my opinion, we owe them better.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes. Yeah, I would concur that we do owe them better. And, I hope that at some point we are talking about this type of a proposal with a fully seated FCC and a shift towards utility style regulation of this critical infrastructure. So.
And I can quite agree that a change of emphasis at the FCC would make a big difference, or is a promising direction in which to lean. As I said a moment ago, the absence of federal activity in the enforcement arena, or the holding carriers accountable to their representations, is just mystifying to me. It's also, unfortunately, also something of an impediment to state action given the preemption implications.
Well, I would note, and I'm happy to provide this information to the committee. I've provided it in the past, I believe, to the commissioner. These entities that have received tremendous amounts of public funds are also expending tremendous amounts of funds to lobby against regulation and prevent the fifth member of the FCC from being seated. And so, it's just a circle of insanity here with the money going around and around, and accountability.
Further questions? Not seeing any. Thank you for joining us today.
It was a pleasure, Madam Chair. If you have any further follow-up, I'm happy to send in the people who would have done a better job than I did, minus Corey, who there is no equal to Corey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
All right, members, are there further comments or questions before we adjourn today?
Timing for budget. Narrow it towards the end of the week, maybe next week.
We are moving through the budget quickly. So in anticipation of testimony tomorrow morning, it would be great for all of you to look into, we're going to hear from the Agency of Natural Resources in the morning. And the Natural Resources Board, both of them in the morning. So digging into the budget information would be helpful. Representative Pat.
I just want to let committee members know, as some of you do know, that I have been working with the it's the statewide association at ORCA, the community video broadband, for a potential bill. Their funding, because it's been based entirely on revenue from the cable companies, has been declining, and that's been a problem, and it's been stopgap funded with some general funds over time. I've been working with them on a bill, but that will not be bringing it's still being worked on. It will not be bringing revenue immediately. And at the same time, they have been speaking with people in appropriations about a general fund appropriation to basically make up the difference and keep them whole. And I just want to let people know that that is in the works. And I would expect that the appropriations might ask, or we could have input with appropriations on that.
Yeah, I would support us looking at how to keep the pegs going. They're pretty important during COVID, in particular, helping Vermonters continue to participate in government. I would say that we're pretty far away from a sustainable funding mechanism for them. They want to look at, we need to look at the whole telecommunications tax structure.
That stands for Vermont Access Network.
Yeah. So, and they are, the more successful we are with deploying fiber, the less revenues they have.
has a specific amount in mind. So I understand it, and from what I understand, that amount is actually reflective of what they really need. I think it's 3 million, but I'm not sure. But we should look at that because that's. Is it, maybe that's.
I think it's
Maybe it is.
really too.
I'm mentioning that because that's not in the proposed, in the administration's proposed budget, so that would be the request coming aside from that.
Any other comments?